My name is Linda Carver, and the moment my father-in-law divided his land among his 3 children, with my name nowhere on any document, was the moment I learned how loud silence can be. I sat there at the edge of his old oak dining table, the same table where we'd carved Thanksgiving turkeys and blown out birthday candles for decades, and watched him hand each of his children a neatly folded packet containing maps, boundary lines, and future plans. But when he reached the end of the stack, he simply closed the folder, cleared his throat, and said, "That's all." No one looked at me. Not my husband, not his brothers, not his sister. They shifted in their chairs, some pretending to read their packet again, others pretending to wipe invisible crumbs from their shirts. I wasn't handed anything, not even a polite explanation. I kept my hands clasped in my lap, feeling the weight of every year I had spent helping this family, cooking for them, driving his father to doctor appointments, mowing the yard when my husband's bad back flared up, and taking care of the old farmhouse when everyone else was too busy. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask why not because I wasn't hurt, but because I knew something they didn't know. Life eventually circles back, and when it does, it never forgets who stood where. Still, that afternoon sat in my chest like a cold stone. I watched the siblings flip through their papers with the eagerness of children opening Christmas gifts. My brother-in-law even slapped his packet against his palm and said, "Well, I guess Dad made his wishes clear." My husband Mark looked at me then, just for a flicker of a second, as if he expected some kind of outburst. But all he saw was me sitting still, my face calm, my breath steady. That seemed to unsettle him more than any shouting would have. After the meeting, everyone moved into the living room for coffee. I stayed back in the kitchen, rinsing mugs and running warm water over the same spoon again and again. I needed a moment to gather myself. My heart felt tight, but something deeper, a steady sense of clarity, began forming. His father, Robert Carver, walked into the kitchen slowly. He had that stern posture old Midwestern farmers never quite lose. He leaned on the counter, clearing his throat before speaking. "Linda," he said, not looking at me, "I know you probably have questions." But I didn't. I knew the answer already. He wanted everything to stay in the bloodline. Many families in our town were the same. My mother-in-law, God bless her, would have never allowed this. But she'd passed 9 years earlier, and something in Robert had hardened since. "I'm fine," I said, and I meant it in a way I couldn't yet explain. Weeks went by, then months, and life moved as life does. The children went back to their own routines, eager to claim their new pieces of land, each dreaming of what they'd build or sell. But Robert started slowing down. His memory began slipping. First, small things, Key's medication times, then bigger things, like forgetting whether he'd eaten or where he'd parked his old blue truck at the grocery store. I was the one who noticed first. I was the one who took him to his appointments. I was the one who sat with him in the cold waiting room as the doctor explained early-stage cognitive decline. Mark was working extra shifts at the plant. The siblings had their own families, and visiting Robert became something they did only on holidays. "Would you mind stopping by in the mornings?" Robert asked me once, voice quiet and hesitant, "just to check that I've taken my pills." Of course I said, and I did, because no matter how things turned out, I believed in doing what was right, not what was easy. I helped him straighten out mail sort medications, change light bulbs, and cook small meals he could reheat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was human. and maybe that mattered more than any property line. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed to Mark, but inside was paperwork from the hospital and Robert's insurance company updates on his power of attorney status. The renewal form had a spot for a primary contact, and without hesitation, Mark scribbled my name. "They'll just call you," he muttered. "You're the one who keeps track of everything anyway." I didn't react. I simply placed the paper in our file drawer. But in the back of my mind, I felt a quiet shift, a turning of the tide. Robert's health declined, faster than anyone expected. He grew frail, slower, weaker, and one cold March morning, as I walked into his house with a bag of groceries, I found him slumped over the kitchen table, his breathing shallow, his face pale. My hands didn't shake. I called 911, held his hand as the paramedics worked, and rode with him to the hospital. Hours later, the rest of the family arrived, frazzled, disheveled, and overwhelmed. They demanded to know everything: his condition, what the doctors had said, what forms needed signing, what decisions needed making. But the doctors turned to me, only me. "Mrs. Carver, the surgeon, said we need your approval to proceed." Then those who inherited the land stood behind me helpless. I stood in front steady. And that was the moment everything began. I didn't sleep well after that day at the farmhouse. Not because I was angry. Anger is loud, and what I felt was quiet, heavy, like a coat someone draped over my shoulders when I wasn't looking. Mark snored beside me, completely, unaware that something inside our marriage had shifted an inch, just an inch, small enough to ignore, large enough that I knew it was never going back to its original place. Life, however, doesn't pause for emotional discomfort. The next morning, I got up, brewed coffee, packed Mark's lunch for his shift at the plant, and fed the neighbor's dog while they were visiting their daughter in Wisconsin. Everything felt normal, and in a way that normalcy was its own kind of ache. Weeks turned into months. Autumn came with its familiar Midwest chill, golden soybean fields, the smell of wood smoke, and neighbors raking leaves into neat piles that the wind would undo by morning. People in our town don't gossip loudly, but whispers travel. At church, a few women approached me with soft voices. "I heard Robert divided the land," one said, stirring sugar into her styrofoam cup. "Yes," I answered, and she pressed gently. And nothing, I replied, offering a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Robert still invited the family over every few Sundays, but I knew the truth. He liked hosting, but he relied on me to get everything ready. I'd arrive 2 hours early to set the table, thaw the roast, and start the potatoes. The others came right at dinner time, arms empty, and when the meal ended, they left their plates for me, disappearing into the living room to scroll on their phones or argue about football. I didn't complain. My silence wasn't submission, it was discipline, a way of choosing who I wanted to be even when no one was looking. As for Robert, he softened toward me, in small ways, asking if I'd eaten, insisting I take home leftovers, thanking me for helping around the house. But not once did he mention the land. I think he believed his decision had protected tradition, whatever that meant. I also think some part of him knew he'd hurt me, but people of his generation rarely apologize directly. They show it in casseroles, in leftover pie, not in words. Still, I kept checking on him. At first, once a week, then twice, then every other day. Not because I wanted to be a martyr, because I'd seen this before. My own mother had declined similarly, and I recognized the small signs, repeating the same story, twice, forgetting whether the oven was still on, letting bills pile up unopened on the counter. One morning, I arrived to find the mailbox overflowing, the porch light still on from the night before, and Robert sitting in his recliner, wearing mismatched shoes. He looked embarrassed when I pointed them out, muttering something about the darn dog moving things around. He didn't have a dog. I made him breakfast and sat down across from him at the table. "Robert," I said gently, "maybe we should schedule a checkup." He grimaced. "Doctors like to find problems that aren't there." "Yes," I said softly, "but sometimes they catch the ones we don't see." He stared down at his coffee for a long time. Then he nodded. At the clinic, the doctor, a young woman who reminded me of my niece, explained early cognitive decline. Nothing dramatic, nothing hopeless, but real enough to need monitoring. Robert absorbed the news quietly, his jaw tight. Pride is a heavy coat for older men in rural towns. It keeps them warm until it starts to suffocate them. I drove him home. Afterward, neither of us spoke. When we pulled into his driveway, he finally said, "You won't tell the others yet, will you?" "Not unless you want me to," I replied. He exhaled shoulders, relaxing slightly. "Thank you, Linda." That was the moment I realized that although I wasn't in his will, I was in his life, and maybe that mattered more. His children, my in-laws, were busy people. They had their excuses, lined up neatly, like cans in a pantry work, kids' vacations, back injuries, car trouble, you name it. They came around for holidays, and when they wanted help fixing something, but daily responsibility wasn't their style. Caring for Robert wasn't glamorous. It didn't earn anyone applause or Facebook likes. But it needed doing, and I did it. Not out of obligation, out of humanity. In those years, I rarely raised my voice about anything. I learned the rhythm of quiet endurance, morning pill checks, afternoon grocery runs, evening reminders to turn off the stove. I helped him organize his old farm documents, repair a loose porch step, sort through decades of tax papers that should have been thrown out long ago. Once, when I gently reminded Mark to call his father, he snapped, "Why do you care so much, Linda? You're not even in the will." And I remember standing there, dish towel in hand, thinking, that's exactly why. Because compassion shouldn't depend on inheritance. Because decency shouldn't depend on being rewarded. Because families, even flawed ones, still deserve someone who shows up. Not long after that argument, an envelope arrived from Robert's insurance provider, an update on his medical directive. Mark signed it absent-mindedly while eating leftovers, sliding the form toward me. "Just put your number down," he said. "You're the one who actually handles things." I filled in the information without a word, but something inside me shifted. It felt like a hinge turning a door quietly unlocking. I sensed the future reshaping itself, though I couldn't yet see how. The quiet years continued like that, steady, unremarkable to anyone but the two of us. I started noticing Robert depending on me in small ways, leaving his grocery list on the fridge for me to find calling when he couldn't remember how to reset the microwave clock, asking me to join him on porch evenings because it's too quiet out here alone. The siblings never saw those moments. They only saw land. I saw a man trying his best to hold on to the world as it blurred around him. And deep inside, a quiet truth was growing. Life may not be fair, but it is always faithful in its returns. Robert's health didn't fall apart all at once. It happened in pieces, quiet, almost invisible pieces, like a sweater unraveling from a single loose thread. At first, it was little things forgetting where he put the remote, calling me twice in one morning to ask what day it was leaving the stove burner on after warming soup. And even then, he'd joke it off saying, "That's what happens when a man lives long enough to outgrow his own memory. But as winter settled over Indiana, something in him slowed, and not in the charming aging farmer way. This was deeper. He began repeating questions within minutes. He'd start a sentence, then pause, halfway through, eyes drifting, as though the rest of the thought had slipped behind a locked door. I noticed he started eating less too. Food spoiled in his fridge. He'd pour orange juice into coffee by accident, stare at the mug, then laugh it off like it was the most natural thing in the world. But it wasn't natural. Not for Robert Carver, a man who had spent his whole life managing farm equipment finances, livestock, and half the neighborhood kids who worked his land every summer. One cold January morning, I drove over with eggs and groceries and found him standing in the yard, wearing only a flannel shirt, no coat, holding his truck keys, and staring at the mailbox. "Robert," I said, gently, stepping out of the car, "what are you doing out here? It's freezing." He blinked at me, confused. I thought it was Sunday. I thought I needed to go to church." "It's Wednesday," I said softly, "and church doesn't start until 10. He looked at the house, then at me, then at the mailbox, as if all three were strangers. That was the moment the truth settled on me, like snowfall, quiet, but undeniable. I called the doctor the next day. At the clinic, the nurse took his vitals, while he tried to flirt with her, pretending everything was fine. But when the doctor asked him to draw a clock, he drew a circle and wrote random numbers around it. No pattern, no sequence. When she asked him to remember 3 simple words, apple penny table, he repeated apple twice and forgot the other 2 immediately. His eyes watered, though he hid it by pretending to cough. I sat beside him and placed a hand over his. He didn't pull away. The doctor spoke to us afterward in her calm, steady voice. "It's not advanced dementia," she explained, "but it is early cognitive decline. It will progress, slowly or quickly, we can't predict. But he will need help." I nodded. Robert stared at the floor. Driving him home that day was one of the hardest drives of my life. The man beside me, in the passenger seat, looked smaller somehow, like someone had turned down the brightness inside him. He kept rubbing his hands together, a fidget I'd never seen before. When we reached his driveway, he turned to me and said, "Please don't tell the kids yet." I looked at his weathered face, the deep lines that life and loss had carved over decades, and I saw fear not of dying, but of becoming a burden, of being pitied, of losing dignity. "I won't, I promised. Not until you're ready." He exhaled with relief, leaning his head back against the seat. That moment changed something between us. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. It was understanding, the kind that appears only when 2 people see each other's vulnerability at the same time. Over the next months, I adjusted my schedule. I visited him every day instead of every other. I labeled his pill bottles more clearly, color-coding them, so he wouldn't confuse morning and evening doses. I filled his fridge with simple meals he could reheat. I left notes on the counter. "Lunch is in the blue container. Turn off the stove. Don't forget your jacket." Some days were better than others. Some days he'd joke tease or tell me old stories about the farm when his wife was alive. Other days he'd stare out the window at the flat Indiana fields and ask Linda, "Why do the sunsets here look different? They didn't used to look like this." I knew what he meant. It wasn't the sunset that changed. It was him. One afternoon in late March, I found unpaid bills stacked on his table, 6 months' worth. He'd been hiding them from the others, embarrassed by his own confusion. I sat with him for 2 hours, organizing everything, setting up autopay, and making calls, while he watched with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "You're a good woman," he said, quietly, voice cracking. "I didn't treat you fairly. I know that." It was the closest thing to an apology I ever got, and it was enough. Around this time, the siblings became noticeably more distant. They rarely visited unless it was for holidays or birthdays. Land ownership had become their new obsession. They spent more time arguing about boundaries, fences, zoning regulations, and property taxes than they ever spent asking about their father's well-being. Sometimes, when I'd bring Robert to the store, we'd run into one of them. They'd smile politely, ask a quick, "How's Dad doing?" and rush off with their carts filled with organic snacks and overpriced candles. None of them noticed how tired he looked. None of them saw his hands tremble. None of them knew he kept a photo of his late wife tucked into his pocket so he wouldn't forget her face on a bad day. But I did. The turning point came when Robert got lost driving home from his friend's house. It was only 4 miles away. He'd made the drive for 40 years. A sheriff found him parked on the side of County Road 12, shaking, unsure where he was or how long he'd been sitting there. When he called me from the patrol car, his voice quivered. "Linda, I didn't want the kids to know. Please don't let them take my keys." My heart broke for him. I picked him up, took him home, and gently laid his keys in a drawer. "Only for now," I said. "Not forever." He nodded, eyes glassy, but didn't argue. It wasn't land. It wasn't inheritance. But in his heart, in his fear, in his fading world, I was the person he trusted. And that trust was going to matter far more than any piece of property. The morning Robert was hospitalized began like any Indiana Indiana spring, morning gray skies, a cold drizzle tapping rhythmically against the windshield, and the kind of damp chill that settles in your bones before noon. I'd promised to stop by with fresh groceries and check his blood pressure, something he'd been struggling with more lately. I remember gripping the steering wheel a little tighter that morning, not because I sensed something was wrong, but because I'd grown used to the unpredictability of his days. When I arrived, the house was unusually quiet. His porch light was still on from the night before, glowing faintly through the rain. I knocked once, then twice. No answer. The third time, the door creaked open from the force of my hand, just slightly ajar. "Robert," I called out gently. "It's Linda." "Nothing." The silence inside felt thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. I stepped into the kitchen and found him slumped in his chair, his head tilted forward, one hand clutching the edge of the table, as if he'd tried to stand but couldn't. His glasses sat crookedly on his nose, and the half-eaten oatmeal on the counter had gone cold. "Robert," I rushed to him, touching his shoulder. His skin felt colder than usual, and when he lifted his eyes to me, they were glassy and unfocused. His mouth moved, but the words wouldn't come out. My heart dropped. He struggled, hard. They loaded him onto the stretcher, and I felt his trembling hand reach toward mine. I took it without hesitation, climbing into the ambulance beside him. "Family," one of the paramedics asked. "Daughter-in-law," I said. "And primary contact." The last part caught even me by surprise. I'd known it was true, now legally, but the weight of those words didn't fully hit until that moment. At the hospital, they swept Robert away for scans and labs. I stood in the hallway, staring at the double doors, feeling the cold air conditioning against my damp clothes. Everything smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, the unmistakable scent of crisis. I'd been here before with loved ones. I knew the rhythm of waiting, of pacing, of clinging to any update like oxygen. 2 hours later, Robert was stabilized, but sedated, hooked up to IV fluids and monitors that blinked steadily. A nurse explained that he'd experienced a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, she said, but he needed close observation to ensure it didn't worsen. "Mrs. Carver," the doctor said, approaching me in the hallway, "we'll need the power of attorney documents to proceed with some decisions." I nodded. "I have them." When Mark and his siblings finally arrived, almost 3 hours later, they burst into the waiting room with frantic voices. "Where is he? What happened? Why didn't anybody call us? Why weren't we notified sooner?" I took a breath. "I did call," I said calmly. "I called Mark. He didn't answer, and the hospital contacted the number on file." They all turned toward me. Then faces flushed, eyes wide, stunned. My brother-in-law spoke first. "You're the contact?" he asked, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "Yes," I said, "and I've been with him since he was brought in." They didn't know what to do with that information. It bounced between them like a loose pinball. The daughter Emily put her hands on her hips. "Well, we should be the ones talking to the doctors," she snapped. "We're his children." I held her gaze. "I'm the one listed on the documents. He made that choice." Her eyes flickered with something sharp resentment, maybe even guilt. The doctor approached, then holding a clipboard. "We have some decisions to review. The authorized contact should come with me." All 3 siblings stepped forward. But the doctor looked directly at me. "Mrs. Carver," he said, "this way, please." I felt their eyes on my back as I followed him down the hallway. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt steady. Quiet confidence is its own kind of revenge, but it never tastes like victory. It tastes like truth. We discussed Robert's medication plan, fall risk, and stroke prevention strategies. The doctor explained the risks of further episodes, the importance of monitoring the possibility of short-term rehab. When I returned to the waiting room, the siblings swarmed me with questions. What did he say? What's going on? Is Dad dying? I explained everything carefully, without drama, sticking to facts. They listened silently. For once. As the afternoon wore on, the siblings began whispering among themselves. Their tones ranged from panicked to frustrated, especially when they realized they had no legal say in anything, not surgery, not medication, not even visiting hours restrictions if it came to that. And that was when the phone calls began. 10 calls in the first hour, while I waited in the cafeteria for updates. Then 15 more while I stepped outside for fresh air. Then 30 more after I left temporarily to pick up Robert's medication list from his house. By evening, the number had climbed past 80. Mark, Emily, their brother, the in-laws, cousins, even a neighbor who somehow got pulled into the chaos. It would have been absurd if it weren't so sad. 80 calls, 80 missed attempts at influence, 80 desperate reminders that they suddenly needed the daughter-in-law they'd spent years overlooking. My silence at the land division had unsettled them. My voice now terrified them, because for the first time, the power unexpected, unplanned, undesired was in my hands. And as the phone kept vibrating with yet another call, I finally understood something. Life doesn't forget who shows up, even if people do. The sound of my phone buzzing didn't stop for nearly 12 hours. It vibrated against the laminate hospital cafeteria table, against the console of my car, against the wood of my nightstand, after I finally got home. Even when I silenced it, the screen lit up again and again, call after call, message after message. 80 in total by midnight. It was strange, really. In all the years I'd been married into the Carver family, they'd never needed me. Not once. I was the one who brought food, offered rides, baked pies for Thanksgiving, and helped clean up after family events. I was the one they overlooked, talked over, or simply treated like part of the furniture. And now, suddenly, they needed me more than they knew how to express. The first voicemail came from Emily, her voice frantic. "Linda, call me back, please. We need to talk about Dad's care plan. This isn't something you should be handling alone." The second message was from Mark, sounding equal parts exhausted and irritated. "Linda, just answer your phone. We need to sort this out. Dad wouldn't want everything going through you." The third was from my brother-in-law, Jason, angry enough that he forgot to hide it. "You can't just ignore us. We're his kids. You can't make decisions like you're running the show." By the 10th voicemail, their voices all sounded the same, urgent, impatient, entitled, as if the universe had made some clerical error putting me in charge. I didn't ignore them out of spite. I ignored them because I needed space to breathe. I needed time to think clearly, not be shoved into decisions by the same people who'd shrugged off their father's care until it suddenly mattered to their inheritance. Around 11 p.m., I sat at the edge of my bed and finally listened to the last batch of messages. The final voicemail was from Robert's youngest granddaughter, a gentle soul who had no part in the land drama. "Aunt Linda, Mom's crying. Uncle Jason and Dad are fighting. Everyone's upset. I don't understand what's happening. Can you just, please, help?" Her small voice cracked something open in me, not guilt, clarity. I wasn't doing this to teach anyone a lesson. I wasn't using the legal power to punish them. I was simply doing what I'd always done, showing up where no one else would. And yet, the emotional storm swirling around them wasn't entirely unwarranted. Losing control is a frightening thing, especially when you've spent your whole life believing you deserve it. The next morning, I returned to the hospital before sunrise. The hallways were quiet, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of antiseptic and brewing coffee. Robert was asleep when I walked into his room, snoring lightly, his chest rising and falling beneath the thin blanket. Machines beeped steadily beside him. I stood there for a while, just studying him, the stubborn set of his jaw, the thinning white hair, the faint scars on his hands from decades of farm work. He looked smaller somehow, more human, more breakable. A nurse stepped inside, clipboard in hand. "You here to check on Mr. Carver?" "Yes," I said. "Any changes overnight?" "He slept through most of it. His vitals look steadier. We're monitoring for another episode." "Thank you," I replied. She paused before leaving. "Oh, and just so you know, your husband and his siblings arrived about 15 minutes ago. They're in the family room." Of course they were. I inhaled deeply before walking down the hall. The family room door was partially open. Inside, Emily paced back and forth like a restless cat. Jason sat hunched over elbows, on his knees, rubbing his face. Mark leaned against the counter, sipping burnt hospital coffee. The moment they saw me, all three straightened. "Linda," Mark said, trying to maintain a calm he didn't feel. "We need to talk." I closed the door behind me gently. "I figured you would." Jason spoke first, blunt as always. "You can't keep shutting us out." "I haven't shut anyone out," I replied evenly. "I've been at the hospital doing what needed to be done." Emily crossed her arms. "But the doctor should be talking to us. We're his children." "They did talk to you," I said. "You just weren't here yet." The room fell quiet. I continued. "The hospital follows whatever is written on the legal documents, and those documents list me as the primary decision maker. That's not my rule. That's Robert's paperwork. That doesn't make it right, Jason snapped. Maybe not, I said, but it makes it real. Mark approached me, then lowering his voice. We just want to be included. This is Dad. I felt something soften inside me. Because despite everything, Mark wasn't a cruel man. Just a man who'd grown comfortable, letting everyone else do the hard emotional work. Then be included, I said quietly. Show up. Ask questions. Stay with him. But don't expect me to hand over responsibilities, simply because they make you uncomfortable. Emily's eyes filled with tears, not dramatic ones, but the kind that come from exhaustion and fear. I'm scared, she whispered. Dad's all we have left. For the first time, I believed her. Before I could respond, a doctor knocked and entered with a chart. We need to make some decisions about Mr. Carver's next steps. One authorized contact, please. All eyes shifted to me again. I didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't revel in their helplessness. Instead, I said, you can all come with me, but the final signature will be mine. They nodded silently, relief overshadowing pride. We followed the doctor into a small consultation room where he explained Robert's options, risk levels, treatments, recovery path. They listened carefully, occasionally, asking questions, their anger replaced with worry. When it was time to sign the consent form for the medication plan, I felt every gaze on my hand as I picked up the pen. The pen didn't feel like power. It felt like responsibility, the kind I'd carried long before any document made it official. Afterward, the siblings dispersed to make phone calls or get coffee, leaving me alone in the hallway. My phone buzzed again this time, a text from Emily. Thank you. I mean it. I exhaled, long and slow. The chaos had quieted. The storm was passing. Not because I fought them, but because I didn't. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the moment before truth takes its rightful place. And deep down, I knew the moment of truth was coming soon. I didn't answer the 80 calls because I wanted space to think, quiet space, the kind you can only find when you let the world wring itself into exhaustion. But eventually, there comes a moment when silence has done all it can and a single sentence has to finish the work. That moment arrived the next morning. I had just finished talking with the nurse about Robert's physical therapy evaluation when my phone buzzed again. Mark. I almost ignored it, but something in my chest nudged me to answer. Maybe it was time. Maybe silence had run its course. I stepped into the hallway, took a breath, and picked up. Linda Mark's voice cracked. Please, can you just talk to us? Emily's crying. Jason's losing his mind. We don't know what to do. I leaned against the wall, watching a janitor mop the linoleum floor with slow, practiced strokes. What you do now, I said calmly, is what you should have done years ago. He didn't respond. I continued. You show up. You take responsibility. You stop treating your father's care like something you can delegate whenever it's inconvenient. Still silence on his end, but this time, the heavy listening kind. Linda, please, he finally whispered. We're begging you. And that was when the words came out, steady, simple, unmistakable. I trusted your decisions when you made them. Now you can trust mine. For a moment, nothing. Not breathing, not movement, just quiet, sharp as glass. Then a soft, stunned exhale from Mark. Linda, what does that mean? It means, I said gently, I'm doing what's best for your father, not what's best for land, or inheritance, or convenience. I hung up before he could reply. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vindictive. I was simply done carrying their guilt and their absence. That afternoon, Robert woke briefly. His eyes fluttered open, confused, at first scanning the room for familiar things. When he saw me sitting beside him, something in his expression softened. "You came," he murmured, voice thin, barely above a whisper. "I've been here," I said, taking his hand, "since they brought you in." He swallowed slowly, lips trembling. I remember something. It might have been a dream. I heard arguing. The kids. They sounded upset. "They're worried," I said carefully. "But you're stable now. The doctors say you just need rest." He closed his eyes again, tears gathering at the corners. "Linda, I didn't do right by you." The sentence hung between us like a fragile thread. I could have told him that his apology came too late, that the years of overlooking me were heavy, that being excluded from the land division hurt in ways I didn't yet know how to name. But looking at him, the man, weakened, humbled, clinging to whatever clarity he had left, I realized the truth. I didn't need his land. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need reparations for past wounds. What I needed was the dignity of knowing who I was. So I squeezed his hand gently and said, "Rest now, Robert. We'll talk later." He nodded as his eyes drifted shut again. Later that day, I stepped into the waiting room, where all three siblings sat in stiff, uncomfortable silence. They looked up as I entered, not with anger this time, but with a kind of wary respect. Jason cleared his throat. "How is he?" "He's resting," I said. "He was awake for a few minutes." They nodded, each absorbing the information, with the quiet that grief and fear carve into people. Emily stood up, wringing her hands. We're sorry, Linda, for how we acted yesterday." I didn't respond right away. I simply watched her, this woman who'd always been defensive, prickly quick to judge. Now her face was stripped of all that. She looked younger, smaller. "Listen," I finally said softly. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here because your father needs someone present, steady and focused. I've been doing that for years. All I ask is that from this point on, you show up too." She nodded, tears forming again. "We will." Jason added, quieter than I'd ever heard him. "Just tell us what to do. We'll help." The sincerity surprised me. Maybe my sentence had done exactly what I hoped, not to shame them, but to wake them. Around dinner time, the doctor asked me to step into a private consultation room. The siblings rushed to follow, but the doctor held up a hand. "One authorized contact only." They froze. I waited a moment, then said, "They can come with me, but the signature is mine." The doctor considered, then nodded and allowed them inside. We discussed rehabilitation options, medication side effects, dietary changes, and the possibility of short-term memory loss worsening. The siblings asked questions respectfully, no longer speaking over me, no longer assuming entitlement. When the moment came to sign the directive allowing Robert to begin treatment, the room went silent. I picked up the pen and signed. Not as revenge, not to prove a point, not to hold power over anyone. I signed because it was the right thing to do. Afterward, the doctor left, and the four of us stood awkwardly in the quiet consultation room. This time, no one pushed, no one barked orders, no one demanded explanations. It felt different, balanced. As we stepped back into the hallway, Mark touched my shoulder lightly. "Thank you," he murmured. "Really." I looked at him, this man I had loved for decades. This man who sometimes disappointed me, but never stopped trying in his own clumsy ways. And I saw something new in his expression. Humility, gratitude, respect. Something old had broken. Something new had begun. And all it took was one sentence. The weeks that followed Robert's hospitalization unfolded slowly, like a winter thaw, the kind where you don't see dramatic change all at once. You just notice small things melting, softening, shifting towards something gentler. Robert was transferred to a rehabilitation center on the north side of town, the kind with clean hallways, wide windows overlooking a pond, and nurses who called their patients Hon without sounding patronizing. I visited every morning after breakfast, not because I was obligated, but because I wanted to. It felt natural now, like checking on a friend who happened to share my family name. His memory flickered, some days clearer, some days foggy, but whenever I walked into the room, he always said the same thing. "You came back." "Yes," I'd answer, "I'm here." What surprised me most wasn't Robert's recovery. It was the way the rest of the family began showing up too. Emily started coming on Wednesdays, after school drop-off, bringing him fresh coffee from the cafe he liked. Jason visited on Saturdays, fixing the loose arm on Robert's walker or chatting with him about sports. Even Mark, who had once been almost avoidant around hospitals, came before work to read the newspaper with him. They weren't perfect and the visits weren't always long, but they came, consistently, quietly, and Robert noticed. One afternoon, he motioned for me to lean closer. "They're trying," he whispered. "They've never tried like this." "I know," I said. He squeezed my hand, his grip still surprisingly strong. "Thank you for being patient with them, with me." Those simple words felt heavier than any apology he could have given. They carried years of unspoken acknowledgement of the times he overlooked me, underestimated me, forgot the weight I carried in this family. It wasn't forgiveness I felt in that moment. It was recognition, a quiet understanding that people sometimes grow in the most unexpected seasons of their lives. During one of our visits, a rehab coordinator pulled me aside. "Mr. Carver will need someone to help manage his affairs long term," she said. "Bills, appointments, insurance. Are you comfortable continuing as primary?" Before I could answer, I heard a voice behind me. "We'd like to help with that too." It was Emily. She stepped forward, wringing her hands nervously. "You've done so much already," she said. "Let us take on some of the load. All of us." I studied her face for a moment, the vulnerability in her eyes, the sincerity in her voice. She meant it. "All right," I said slowly, "but we do it together." She nodded, relieved. From then on, we divided responsibilities. Jason handled home maintenance. Emily organized medical paperwork. Mark managed transportation and pharmacy pickups. And I continued coordinating the overall care plan. But this time, I wasn't alone. The burden had shifted from solitary to shared, from silent to collaborative. I couldn't help but think how different things might have been if they'd done this years earlier. But life doesn't always give us perfect timing. Sometimes, it just gives us the chance to choose better, now, not before. A month later, Robert was cleared to return home. The siblings spent the weekend cleaning his house, restocking his pantry, installing grab bars in the bathroom, fixing the loose steps on the porch, and rearranging furniture so he could move around safely. They worked together. They argued a little, but in the comfortable way families do, when they're trying, not fighting, just figuring things out. I watched from the kitchen doorway, smiling at the chaos of it all. On Sunday evening, after the house settled into its familiar quiet, Robert called me into the living room. "I want to talk to you," he said, patting the cushion beside him. I sat down slowly, He held a worn envelope in his hands, one of those legal-size ones with a metal clasp on the back. "I've been thinking," he said, "about fairness, about legacy, about what I leave behind." My heart thudded once hard. He continued, "I can't change what I did before, but I can change what I do now." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a simple letter, naming me as a secondary beneficiary of one of his accounts, not a fortune, not a replacement for the land, just something, a gesture of gratitude, of acknowledgement, of respect. "I don't need this," I said softly. "I know," he said, "but I need to give it." His eyes were clear, his voice was steady. It wasn't guilt speaking, it was conviction. I placed the envelope on the coffee table. "Thank you," I whispered. For the first time in a long time, he smiled fully. In the months that followed, our family settled into a new rhythm. Not perfect, not without tension, but real. The kind of rhythm you get when people finally stop performing roles and start simply being present. The land division was never brought up again. Not once. It didn't need to be. The wound had closed, not because it was healed by property or money, but because it was healed by truth, responsibility, and shared effort. One evening, after a long day of appointments, Mark and I sat on our porch, watching the sunset cast warm colors across the fields. He reached for my hand. "You know," he said quietly, "you held this family together, even when we didn't deserve it." I squeezed his hand. We all held something, even if some of us didn't know it at the time. He leaned his head against mine. For the first time in years, I felt peace. Real peace. The kind that comes when silence doesn't hurt anymore, when it becomes the calm after the storm. And as I watched the last sliver of sun sink below the horizon, I felt something settle inside me. We don't always get the apology we expect. We don't always get the fairness we want. But we can choose to walk through the world with grace. And sometimes that grace becomes the very thing that changes people. To anyone listening now, if you've ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or forgotten, remember this. Your worth is not measured by what others give you, but by what you choose to give the world despite them. Thank you for staying with my story. If it touched you, I hope you'll share it, reflect on it, and maybe subscribe for more stories, just like this stories that remind us we're never as alone as we feel.